In the late 90s, everything was going gung-ho. The NASDAQ was up over 5,000 right before it crashed in early 2000. Dot-coms were being flipped and sold at incredible prices. There was a lot of money just floating around, and in our church body too. There wasn't a sense that it was ever going to stop. And so we decided that in that exuberance of the late 1990s, we decided that this would be a great project.
I note that we began in spring of 1997, and I gather from the report that's in the same file in my computer, concluded our work at the end of that summer, end of August 97. And as a subcommittee, we considered, no surprise, architecture, and that was a subcommittee of the overall new chapel committee.
So in the late 90s, it was probably about 97 or 98 that someone at the Synod headquarters came up with the idea of these projects for the 150th anniversary of the WELS.
An offering, a special chapel offering, was being gathered, and the hope was that construction could begin promptly on or shortly after that celebration of the sesquicentennial, or maybe even before. Again, the details are blurry. That didn't come to pass. As I recall, there were parameters regarding the funding of that chapel, and therefore the target couldn't be met unless those parameters were met, and I believe it was that all the funds had to be on hand before ground could be broken. Various things in the economy, of course the size of the gift gathered, even things as interesting as the price of steel in China, caused the cost of the projected chapel to stay ahead of that gift, which continued to grow from things that people gave, but also even just from the basic interest of thoughtful storage of the money that had been gathered.
There were plans drawn up for that. There was probably about $700,000 spent on architectural drawings. And the firm that they used was from the Twin Cities. And the design really came out like what you would call a Norwegian stavkirke, with a tall center spire and arching ceilings. Well, I think the estimated price tag on that was about $14 million. And so it kind of just skidded to a halt, and then we didn't know what to do. Then, of course, there was considerable debate about what do you do with the money that God's people in good faith had given for the project. What do we do with it? Do we return it? Do we encourage them to divert it to a mission field? Or, what do you do?
As to whether our work as a committee, and I'm thinking just of this architecture subcommittee, had an impact, I don't know. I look over the committee that was formed in, I suppose, 97. And by that I mean the committee that gathered as the chapel committee, each of these subcommittee chairs under President Olson's leadership in a larger committee. Some of the same names are there that served ultimately for the chapel that was built here. But I don't know. The recollections I have are fading. And I do recall in skimming through that report that there are aspects of things we talk about in there that are not part of this chapel. Nevertheless, one would hope that in a certain sense we at least did spade work, stirred the pot, tried to look at this from lots of perspectives. And if some of those things paid off for the work of the committee that actually did finally bring to construction with the suggestions of architects and so on, then we did our job. But it turned out in that case then not to be what at the time we thought we were shooting for.
I was a chairman of the chapel building committee. And that committee, that really started in our worship committee. The worship committee at one point in time was wondering where the chapel project was going to go. So are we going to actually go ahead and build? Are we going to remain in our chapel auditorium? And so there was thinking on the committee, if we do not build, could we at least do some revamping in the chapel auditorium? Could we do it? Because some of the furnishings were looking pretty worn and beat up.
We were, try to say this nicely, we were not satisfied with the worship life in the auditorium. And we kind of said to ourselves, this is some of our committee members, Professor Moldenhauer and I and Professor Lenz kind of said, well, we got to do something. Either we're going to build a chapel or we're going to renovate the auditorium.
Because, of course, the auditorium, number of windows, I believe, the last I counted was 0, I believe. And then I think each time we've counted, we've found 0 windows in that facility, so.
I have no nostalgia at all for that auditorium, although I worshiped in there for nearly 15 years. It was a place that always felt borrowed, always felt, or often, frequently felt as though it had been, freshly, recently used for things other than worship, which of course is fine. 2 or 3 and many, many more were gathered there, and we were around the word.
And we actually brought in, President Olson was in on this, we actually brought in some WELS guy who was very creative, and we had a bit of a plan about we're gonna renovate this worship space, so we're gonna make it a worship space.
And so we approached the board, our board of control, with the idea, could we do some things in the auditorium? And they said no, which was fine. But then we said, well, if we don't do that, could we consider moving ahead with a chapel project? That was kind of the genesis of that. So the committee actually came out of that worship committee, and we had come up with a slate of names that we proposed to the board, and they approved that slate. So
after a period of time, and this is still before I got there, I believe the governing board agreed to appoint a building committee, and here's the amount of money that had come out of the synod offering, and it was the 7.2 or 7.5, and that's the amount of money. What can you do for that? So they authorized this building project. When they went back and took a look at that other original plan, they said, there's no way we're going to be able to cut this down and make this happen for that amount of money.
Our chapel building committee was at first named something like the chapel feasibility committee, which had the basic question with the money that has been given, which I think was about $8 million, somewhere between 7 and 8. Could we still build the chapel we wanted that would serve the campus's needs and not just be a real bare bones, low budget thing? And so that's where so when we interviewed architects, we gave them that price ceiling, whatever it was, and then they had to submit rough designs of within that budget for us. And then at the end of that process, it was determined, yes, we could build a chapel that would serve well for that money.
The first chapel plan had some great designs, but at the same time, it also incorporated some good things for the college, some offices, some links, and it got to be a very large project. And then when the synod offering really didn't bring in the type of money, not just for that project, but throughout, it became very difficult to consider how we're going to build something for that price. And if I remember right, I believe it was $15 million was the price tag on that.
We started with theology, our understanding of what worship is. And the driving part of that was, if worship is proclamation of Christ, if that is what worship is, both by pastor and by congregation and by musicians who either lead or proclaim themselves, if that's the case, what will the building look like? How will the building accommodate that kind of proclamation? So that led to a lot of things, like What's the role of acoustics in that? Who do you hear in the building as you are participating and proclaiming? Who do you hear? How do you hear them? That part. Visually, who do you see? Do you see only a leader? Do you see musicians? Do you see each other? You know, visually, what's it like? And what's the focal point in the building itself if the building is to be a place for proclamation? And in the design, that actually played out in what will the building say? What will it proclaim? When a visitor or a member walks in, what's first thing that they encounter? And then our second step was to take our concepts for how the building's going to carry out the theology we have in mind. Our concepts like a baptismal font at the front, at the door, strong emphasis on Christ on the chancel area, a place for musicians on the same level of seating for 1,000, all of those concepts, as well as on the exterior, we said to architects, we want this to look like it belongs here. Like it's not just plopped on the campus, but that it belongs here, maybe even that it's been here a while, that it has a sense of belonging. So we went to that phase, that concept phase, and put it down into several short statements that we sent to architects.
We did something a little unusual, and that was had a competition among 5 architectural firms after we had looked at a number of other firms. I think it was a dozen or 15 different firms that we looked at, and then invited 5 of those to submit a proposal to us. And we gave them certain parameters, the seating capacity, the idea that it would have a substantial pipe organ, a large gathering space, the position of the font, the centrality of Christ and Word and Sacraments as being a guiding theme, things like that.
At their own expense, 5 architectural firms drew up a schematic or a basic concept design for the chapel, all supposedly using this scorecard, this list. And it also included it can't exceed X dollars, which was, I guess, $7.5 million, the amount of money that had been given. One firm from the cities, one firm, I believe, from Texas, 2 firms from Wisconsin, forgot where the other one was from. And so that's kind of where it was when I got there. Had opportunity, put all the designs on a table, let the student bodies kind of walk through the boardroom and see the different designs and kind of react to it. Try to give them a little bit of sense of the initial stages of a building project and what's that look like.
And then those 5 firms, we interviewed them all, I think, in one night. It was a real marathon. We were all pretty blurry-eyed by the end.
And then the committee began by winnowing out several of the firms that didn't pay attention to the scorecard, whether cost or theological presuppositions or just what they wanted. And I think I ended up interviewing 2, I believe.
And we thought that was a really helpful project, part of the process, because the normal process is to interview an architect, but when they actually had to bring something to carry out your concept, you got a different picture of them, rather than looking at a design they did for somebody else. How are they going to deal with our concept and that's where things separated out pretty quickly.
We wanted architects that had experience building a church. Unfortunately, the architectural firm that we worked with the first time around did not have any experience building a church. They had never built one. And so we did allow them to, again, present a project idea for the second go-around. They were one of the 5, but it was just clear to us that you need to work with somebody who's done it before. Without that, there's just really is not a good feel for what a church should be, what a church should look like, and there's more of we felt an emphasis on the exterior, the statement that the building was making instead of the day-to-day message that the building presents to the people who are worshiping in it.
And as a courtesy, we did allow the company that did the original design of 2000 to come up with another design. Now, not surprisingly, I kind of found it interesting, but it was really, really, really different. It kind of went out. It was more like a square building, and the ceiling had all sorts of curved wood, and the walls had curved wood, and it was basically a box, but it was built out over the pond and seemed to be floating on the water, and it was kind of cool, but there was no way we were going to go with that.
And one of the companies came in with something that was, again, they didn't listen to the instructions because they came in with something radically different from anything on campus, and indicated that at some point every campus has to go in a bold new direction.
There was also a very good plan that came out from another group, and it was interesting because they actually, one of the guys was a former ELCA pastor, Lutheran. So he really had a good feel for Lutheran theology, and the problem with their plan is it was way over budget. It was like $2 to $3 million more than what we actually told them we had.
One or two of them, I believe, didn't even get under the budget figure. Like, they basically said, no, we couldn't do this. Here's what we really think we should do, but this is going to be another several $1 million. And so in a way they were automatically disqualified.
And I understand this too from the vantage point of these architects. Some of them, this is a lot of time on their part to come up with a plan that meets our criteria before they're getting paid. So I felt like some of the architects, it was easier to say no, because they just did not think clearly about what we were trying to do.
Two of the firms definitely came to the top. There was no question about that. And then we talked about those two, and finally decided to go with Plunkett Rasich. I think they did everything we asked them to do in the proposal, in a creative way, in a way that seemed to fit the campus, seemed to fit our goals. They just seemed to be the right group, and I think the excitement of the lead architect in the group, John Holtz, was just totally apparent. And I remember him walking on campus the first day he was here before we ever even did the interviews, and he just was excited about the whole thing. So for me, that was a big thing.
So we prepared, did a whole lot of research on the WELS church, a whole lot of research on Martin Luther College, and the city of New Ulm. Those three were sort of the three pillars of how I was going to really gain an understanding of their project. Did that. They already had a floor plan and a location on their campus that they liked. We looked at it, we sort of vetted it, made sure, yeah, this is right, this feels right, this is the right place for this project. And we took their floor plan, we understood their program, they gave us a program as well, and then we essentially crafted a design for the interview that was good enough to get us to win. And a lot of that initial design came forward in what you see today. So my role from that point remained as the lead designer on the project, the senior project designer whose job it is to do a whole lot of listening and understanding what their needs are, how the building, the church, the chapel I should say, really needed to become the heart of campus. It was a campus that worshiped in an auditorium, and there was no big chapel, no heart of their campus. There was in spirit, but no architectural edifice that described that. So that was the challenge, and that's what we were able to come up with, and I had to lead that effort from massing materiality, nestling in with their existing campus, and making it be the most important building there.
One of the reasons we went with PRA was he seemed to understand our concepts, like a theological concept. We want this to be in focus, we want that to be in focus, and he seemed to grasp that right away. Some other architects, we looked at their design and we said, I'm not sure they really understand what we were saying. But John Holtz he must have done enough, work with churches and that type of design. It was like immediately he knew what we were talking about. So we felt comfortable that when we said something to him, he would understand what we were saying. So it was a good fit, I think, John Holtz and the committee.
John is a good listener. He's a creative guy, and we really are thankful for the creativity that he brought to this, but he listened. And he was able to hear what we were saying and then even hear what we were trying to say and then make it into reality. So we were very often quite pleased with what John would come up with when we were talking about, the front of the church, and where's the triptych going to go, and how's the altar going to go, and how many steps are we going to need, and all those things. He was able to translate quite effectively.
PRA, I just call them PRA all the time. They did a good job on the design and incorporating the main, I'll say, emphasis for the building, which was to have a means of grace focus, reflective of Lutheran worship, at the same time a sense of community, and also worked with, part of the scorecard had audio, that's not a good word, acoustical elements for the use of the chapel. And so they did a good job listening and incorporating into their design some of those main emphases.
They seemed to understand that what we wanted done, number one. Certainly what we got from them as a preliminary, was not what we got at the end. It was a lot of tweaking that went along the way. But for one thing, we liked what we saw. They seemed to be very flexible and easy for us to work with. We felt really comfortable with lead architect, especially John Holtz. Felt like he really understood what we were coming from and was trying his very best to meet our expectations within the budget.
The biggest difficulty, of course, was staying within a budget. And that was a very definite thing that the committee took very seriously. We had a set number of dollars to work with. If we added something for $100, we had to take $100 out. If we added something for $10,000, we had to take $10,000 out. So that was a challenge, and I suppose you could call it a difficulty, but it was a challenge, especially when in our planning we thought we were within budget all the way. When finally the project costs got let out for bids, it was over budget. So that meant going back and looking at how do we get back into budgets. That was probably the biggest challenge along the way.
A lot of the areas where the budget was difficult and we had to make very, very important cuts, I learned that this group was not going to cut the beauty and the quality of the space. They cut out square footage where they needed to before they would compromise the design integrity, which means a lot as an architect that they care enough about the experience in that space. So that was something I learned from them that I don't always learn on with other clients and other projects.
We wanted a chapel that was kind of fan-shaped, because there's beautiful symbolism in God's people gathering around the Word. You have that picture in Revelation 7, where they're all gathered on the mountain of the Lord, which is kind of the ultimate fulfillment of the Feast of Tabernacles. This idea that God's people gather around the Word.
When we received the interview or the competition papers, if you will, the request for proposal, they had identified this shape. There's a history to this project. It had been designed and redesigned a couple times, but I believe they had been really keen on this octagon form, which is a great religious form.
It's basically an octagon in the sanctuary itself. And that's symbolic, of course, of resurrection, of renewal, the 8th day of creation. That was one of our specifics in design.
If we go back to early Byzantine architecture, right at the beginning of what we call the Byzantine period, we see the prominence of this design of the octagon. Now, the octagon, the earliest known example of the octagon as a worship facility has been excavated at Capernaum, right on top of the house of, well, they call it St. Peter's house. And there has to be something to that because this is a very old church. And so the tradition was probably pretty strong. But interestingly enough, it's an octagon shape. Now, we tried to pick that up in this design in several ways. The most obvious is the font. But essentially, the interior space of the building is an octagon shape. Now, what's the symbolism with the octagon? Well, people put out a bunch of ideas, but this really is the heart of it. If you count in Hebrew, they count inclusively. So, Sabbath to Sabbath is not 7 days, it's 8 days. And that number 8 comes to represent the eternal Sabbath, going from Sabbath to Sabbath, as Isaiah says towards the end of his book. In the book of Hebrews, of course, they don't use the term the 8th day or the eternal Sabbath. They call it today. Today we enter his rest, right? And that's really the symbolism behind the 8. Okay? So we tried to pick that up on the interior space, and then the narthex here is basically a rectangle that was attached onto it. The original design, though, did call for an octagon to connect right there. And that was going to be office space. That was going to be Pastor Boder's office. And then on this side, you see now it comes like this, but originally those were triangular rooms that were cut out as a cost-saving measure.
As they laid out the octagon, I think on a couple of the sides, there was going to be room for what would have been multi-purpose rooms. That would have been an extra classroom, which could potentially be very useful. But then also maybe with sliding glass doors for just increased capacity for concerts and things. And as dollar figures were crunched, we decided that that's something that could go, that we'd get along without that.
But the octagon is also a great form just in terms of focusing people toward a common unity, toward a whether it's the altar platform or the worship that's happening in the space, really create a group setting. And what they had was, it was an octagon, but it was stretched out in one direction, as you've seen, and really had no qualms at all about working with that form. Again, it made my job easier that they had already arrived at something. If they arrived at something that was maybe not a successful form, either functionally or visually, we would, we would have said so. But it was a beautiful form to work with.
We visited a number of places, either as a full group or individually. Many of us went to a lot of different places to find out what's going on in church architecture these days, and pick up ideas from all of those places. Sometimes things that said, this is definitely not what we're going to do, and other places where this is really, really workable idea.
Well, we looked at, hundreds of pictures of different churches, and we looked at hundreds of pictures of baptismal fonts, and we looked at, hundreds of different samples of this, that, and the other thing along the way. We visited a number of churches that were PRA people or churches that had this kind of same design coming out, and I don't know, a couple months of just thinking.
We met rather regularly for a while, weekly, and a little later on, not quite as often. But we did make all the choices together. The design, we discussed design and issues we had.
Some very long meetings. I believe some were 10, 11, and 12 hours long. And yet it wasn't as though we were just meandering or going in circles or having pointless discussions. We were always moving forward. For a project that large, it took a lot of time. But our chairman, as I said, didn't waste our time. He kept us on task and kept pointing us toward the various things we had to get done.
I think one of the main objectives one day, a whole trip to New Ulm, which takes about 7 hours of driving, is to agree upon the brick. And we had several brick samples, I think mostly from Sioux City in Iowa, and fairly close to that neck of the woods. So we would walk around all the campus buildings with all of these samples. Some are quite heavy, putting them up against this building, putting them up against that building, and arriving at the design or the manufacture and the pattern, the blend of the brick.
The seating in the chapel, the color of the cloth on the seating, it was just an interesting meeting.
Which reminds me of the miracle of the fabric swatches, if you'd like to know about that. Miracle, okay, that's too strong of a word, but when it came time to pick the fabric for all the chairs, after we picked the chairs, we had, several large, heavy books of those sample swatch books.
And we were, we're sitting there making these, looking at the different fabrics, and we're we looked around at each other. We're in the basement of the library, in that library conference room.
And I think it was pretty well agreed. That'd be generally in the green family, but then there's still, if not hundreds, dozens of greens to choose from.
6 men looking at cloth colors, and we have, I don't know, maybe a dozen or 15 in front of us.
And we men on the committee went through, how about these 6? Yes, well, the 6 best. Well, what about these 2? I think these are the 2 best. Well, what about between these 2? We think that one. Yeah, we could agree. That would be a really good one.
And then we look around the room and we say, we're all men. What are the women going to think?
So we actually brought down all the ladies in the library who were there.
And we laid out all the same samples we had, exactly the same ones, and said, out of these, which one would you pick?
Pick maybe a half dozen, pretty similar to the ones about the same batch we had. No secret signals or advice from us. Then narrowed it down to 2, which happened to be the same 2 we had narrowed it down to. Now at this point, you could have cut the tension in the room with the proverbial knife, because they have come down to the very same 2 finalists the men did. And as everyone held their breath and waited, they at last pointed to,
well, the women picked.
It's the same color that we had chosen.
the very one the men had picked.
We said, that's it, no question. No question. It's got to be the right one.
So we felt, all right, good, we're okay.
And that, my friend, is the miracle of the fabric swatches.
The name of the chapel, that was a huge item. The committee, our dream was, this was going to be Christ Chapel. Well, the chapel over in Gustavus Adolphus, 30 miles from here, St. Peter, the name of that chapel is Christ Chapel. So we felt, no, we just cannot name this chapel by that same name. It'll just look like we're copying. So then we did actually a kind of a poll of students and faculty. What names would you suggest? And then we kind of gathered a group of names. None of those names was the name we have, Chapel of the Christ.
I think the strongest competition, strongest finalists, there was a fair amount of redemption and redeemer, but I think the second most popular would have dwelt with the shepherd or good shepherd theme. And that certainly had its strengths because of Jesus. They were training teachers and pastors and staff ministers, and the word pastor going back to shepherd, and Jesus being the master teacher. So that certainly had its merits. Even there was some thought of the great shepherd, because there's a lot of good shepherds around, but that great shepherd of the sheep is a biblical reference too.
There were things like Good Shepherd Chapel, other names for Jesus, which all are fine, but none of them seemed to. This was one where the committee did not come to consensus. It was always, it's okay, but it's not quite right.
But we didn't go to that. We kept getting back to the simplicity of Christ. And Christ Chapel is simpler than Chapel of the Christ.
And it was really President Zarling who came up with this current name. We were, again, chewing this over, and I don't know which meeting on the name. And he finally said, well, what about naming it Chapel of the Christ to get away from duplicating St. Peter? And that flew immediately.
But then when we looked at the Christ, I forgot the precise number, but certainly dozens of times that phrase is used in the New Testament, the Christ, the Christ. Maybe more than we realize, and then we thought that created something of a teachable moment using that name, which is used so frequently.
And the committee itself was, the committee was a real blessing. It was one of those committees where we all felt free to express our opinions, but then we also were able to always come to consensus pretty easily. And yeah, not everybody got his way, but everybody seemed to be ready to move forward. It was just a great blessing. I mean, one for which we needed to step back and say, well, thank you, Lord, for providing this group to deal this way with this project. It was really a delightful project.
I think of the many committees I've been involved in over the years, this one had a spirit and a sense of the project that was very unified right from the beginning. And we rarely had I don't know that we ever had a major disagreement. We all seem to be thinking the same way, and yet not without our eyes open and our ears open to other ideas and all of that. But the viewpoint and the focus was always the same, and I think that made it a real joy to be a part of.
There are certain rules architecturally about a worship space and how the structure works with it. The two can't be designed separately. And a lot of what they were giving us, their program, the location of the building, the acoustic importance, how they're going to worship and use the space, how many areas of seating they're looking for, and the different other aspects. And then you combine that with my knowledge of working on this building type, this wonderful building type, and combining the structure and the seating and making an emphatic form. They actually dovetailed rather well, and showing the Martin Luther College Building Committee the design from the exterior went very well. The interior design, we did go through the structure was not working out pleasingly.
He originally had the beams running this way. They ran from the front to the back this way. And actually there was a double set of beams on each side going from one end of the building to the other. And we looked at that, and that just did not strike us visually as very pleasing. It looked very boxy. And then we said to him, we're just not unsure about this.
And it was a head scratcher. There was some long nights, overnights on my part here at the office trying to figure out how to make this structure look beautiful, and finally did arrive at it, presented it to them again. Good thing about the process, they were always very positive about it, and yet definitely let me know and let us know, look, this structure is kind of weird. Can you work on it? And we finally got it right, and it's that crossing that you see today that still allows for the clear story windows above. Initially, it just wasn't happening, but it did come together.
The sung word about Christ is especially well suited. We erred on the side of music and the sung word resonating, reverberating well in this space.
At least the musicians on the committee from day one had said, well, we want the space to be acoustically live. And perhaps some of the non-musicians on the committee were wondering what we were talking about initially, but we were talking about reverb time and having live sound in the building. And the musicians on the committee had said, we know what we want. We would like 3 seconds of reverb time when the building's full. That's the goal. So we checked that out with acoustical engineers to see if that's possible. Yes, it's possible. How do you do that with hard surfaces? And in this building, the most surface areas, of course, are the walls and the ceiling. And in the construction, that meant like double drywall in the entire building so that the surface is hard and sends back waves of sound and doesn't flex.
It must be acoustically exquisite. It must be perfect. That was the directive. You can be less than perfect elsewhere, and I hope we weren't, but acoustically the building had to perform very well. After all, it's a $1 million organ, pipe organ that Martin Luther College was going to be installing by Shantz Organ Company in Ohio. Beautiful organ, a great company. This is a vessel, in a way, for that organ to perform well, so that liturgy of music and the word could really sing in that space.
Even the workmen that just set up the organ had nothing to do with its tonal design or anything else. They said this was the only project they could ever remember where any time there was a change in the building, the committee would contact the organ company to see if it was okay. so that really says that how music was in the space was crucial, and certainly in the committee's overall plan and design, we wanted it to be a space where the music of the church could really function exemplary.
We're happy that it turned out just about where we wanted it. When the building's full, we're not quite at 3 seconds. We're maybe at 2.5, 2.4, somewhere around there. Very close, very close. And for music in the building, this is actually something very new on the campus. It's the first building or space that's actually friendly to music. It's friendly. Music travels through the building, and there's reverb, there's presence in the building, and so we see it as just being very friendly to that. It's very easy to be a musician in the building. It's just very easy.
This chapel, the architects came up with the design that there would be an access that was a bit longer. Music works best in a rectangular shape, not a bowl. And so they made this access, the the east-west access, longer, and that would, of course, then we have the music down on that end, and it would be coming down the long access. That was one of the things that was very appealing.
So the building had to be acoustically great, so it sings in the long direction. The choir sings from, I guess when you walk in from the left into the long direction of the space. But also, the other side of acoustics is everything else has to be quiet. The mechanical system has to be quiet. We went through many trials to make sure that Martin Luther College was satisfied with the decibel level of the mechanical system. And we didn't always get it right. We had to go through some effort to make it perfect. And it's a great space now.
And John Holtz was very good again with the design. And so he worked with our acoustical engineer, Scott Riddell, and they came up with a design which has a lot of height, but does not trap sound anywhere.
We have worked with Scott before, so the relationship was already in place. They, what they want to see is that model right away, very early in their effort, so that they can begin testing their acoustic model. So began the design, had the height of the space somewhat figured out, shared it with them, talked about what I wanted to do on the ceiling, and talked about how these beams were going to pass overhead. And it was very important for them that there was a space between the high beam and the ceiling so that that air, that sound could transfer through and not hit up against something. So that was critical, that they're involved early. So it was a very good collaborative relationship, as it has been with them.
So the beams do not go up to the ceiling. There's space above them so that sound can travel across the beam over the top and land over on the other side. And on the floor level, the beams also do not go to the wall. There's space behind them and around them so that sound just does not get trapped. And while the sound isn't the same all the way in every place in the building, it is very good in the entire building. It does travel the way we had hoped it would travel.
There are two sound systems in the building, one that's geared more to speech and functions mostly from the altar platform area. And then there's a system that is designed specifically to help out music if and when needed. And the sense there is that you always feel like the music is coming from the music area. First of all, that's an important thing in audio systems these days. And it can be tweaked in such a way that you don't get the sense that it's amplifying the sound. And we don't need to use it for choirs, that kind of thing. It's maybe a soloist whose voice doesn't quite fill the volume of space.
Another design feature in the building is the place for the worshipers and then place for musicians. So we talked about that early on, and one of the early decisions was that we wanted the building to be large enough to hold the entire student body at one time. It had been a part of the campus worship life prior to this. Everybody on campus saw it as a strength, that everybody on campus gathers together for worship at the same time. It was a real strength for the campus. We wanted to retain it. So we asked that the chapel be able to hold 1,000 worshipers and to be able to do it on a single level without balconies.
Balconies have a certain cost efficiency because you get that many more seats in without necessarily that much bigger of a perimeter of your building. But then it also presents things like maybe additional cost of a elevator to access it. But on the WELS website, I think it's Pastor Gerlach has a discussion of the pros and cons of balconies. But one of the cons is the two congregation concept. It's like you've got the people downstairs, the people upstairs. It works against a little bit the idea of the communion of saints, the body gathered around together.
We talked about the space as a one-room design in church architecture where everybody's on the same plane, so to speak. And the choir, the organ, the instrumentalists are all symbolically a part of the congregation. And to carry that out, we decided not to go with balconies. It's all on one level. The placement to the side rather than in the back or the front says something about the musicians being a part of the congregation. I think those are some of the ways that happened.
Well, I like to think of the layout of the building as an encouragement in the fellowship of believers, because we get to see each other as we worship. We're all on the same level. That's not, we're not trying to make any, I don't think, grand statement there, but we're all a body of believers, and the focal point of our worship is Christ.
We were thinking that the body of Christ should be together on one floor, and we wanted them to be close enough to the leader of worship so that there'd be opportunity to see facial expression and so forth. Architects tell us 75 feet is the limit for that. And so this building everyone is seated within 75 feet of the ambo. And it is a change from the auditorium where we were maybe 125 feet away to the back. And a chaplain just recently said he noticed that he also could see faces clearer, they're closer to him than when they're stretched out. So it was a kind of a symbol of the church in the building, being gathered on one floor and being gathered around the means of grace. So they're seating on three sides. Architects would say a one-room design. And that was a request of us. So that was one thing. The other question was, how do musicians function in the building and where do you put them? So just philosophically, are musicians a part of the congregation, or are they an organization unto themselves? So in other words, do they get a separate room, like a balcony, or are they part of the same floor level as the congregation? Early on, we discussed that, and we decided we wanted the second. We wanted them to be part of the congregation, to function on the same floor, same space, not a separate room, if you will.
We didn't put the organ behind the altar. we put it off to the side. It contributes. I think that says something about our philosophy of music, or not really philosophy, theology of music in worship, and how that is used in worship. The primary goal of the organ is to support congregational singing, not to be a recital instrument, although it does that very well.
Another aspect of the design that we asked architects to think about but didn't think about how to carry it out was, we said the building, besides its primary job of serving as a place for worship, would likely serve as a concert venue. So the seminary chorus comes, where are they going to sing? They're going to sing in the chapel. We do a concert on campus, a sacred concert. Where will it be? Naturally, it's going to be in the chapel. So how do you make the space accommodate that venue? We had always been thinking that this platform would be the place where choirs would function, that they would sing from here out to the congregation.
The initial program design for Martin Luther College showed the choir on the same wall as the presider or as the altar. And I knew, even from my experience, that wasn't going to work very well there. The organ's over here, they're singing here. You want the organ to sing, you want to hear it from behind your ears and move forward. And they're singing in the short direction of the chapel. I knew that wasn't going to quite work. Maybe Riedel could figure it out to augment it with something electronically, whatever. And they're like, no, we got to move the choir as well. So we both agreed to that. It was an easy opportunity to share that with Martin Luther College. They agreed. They're like, sure, this makes sense, and we can get more choir members up here this way, which we did.
And then he suggested to us that if we would use flexible seating for the entire building, we could actually just turn the seating to face the choir and the organ and really never have to touch the chancel area. Immediately that was a hit with the committee. That made sense to us. You don't have to move altar, ambo, you don't have to set up risers on the platform. In other words, the chancel area, the symbol of Word and Sacrament, can stay put. And it gave this whole area kind of a bigger sense of permanence. You think of like Nathan Pope's adding stone, something very solid. Well, the carrying out the idea that there are certain things that are absolutely true and solid. Well, the Word of God is that, and the sacrament is that. And perhaps if we don't have to move those symbols, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it communicates something. Originally, we hadn't thought that way. We had thought the altar would be movable, everything would be movable, so you could accommodate this for a concert. But this allows this to be permanent and that to be functioning this way.
Certainly the size of the choir area was probably more related to our choral program here on campus. We have one choir that's about 100 singers, so we had to have a space to do that. And then when we do our major Christmas concerts or commencement concerts, things like that, we needed to be able to expand that space to 250 to 300 singers. So those are things that certainly affected the design. We went with a movable riser system. Technically it's movable. Practically it's not so very movable at all because they're just big heavy pieces is what it amounts. But it can be done if we choose to do it.
And that space does work very well, not only for daily chapel, where everything's ready to go, and the space over there is very flexible for like adding instruments.
Of course, the people who worship here the most is the campus family. We do try to present people with a variety of worship. Different choirs that sing, different instrumentation. Evening chapel is starting to become even a little more varied. Maybe that's the best word.
We have the opportunity now to do some literature, some music that we really could not do previously, just because of where instrument and choir were located in other buildings. There are some things we could never do in the auditorium because the organ's in one place in the building, choir's always in a different spot. Now with the two together, we're able to do some literature that we could never before think about doing, and do it successfully. And the other thing we've noticed is with the organ itself, the organ's a completely different tonal design.
I think tonally, it's an instrument that represents somewhat the middle of the road in organ building. It is not meant to be a copy of any European instrument from a particular time period. It's not meant to be on the edge of organ building, because there are companies that will do that and do a very fine job of that. We didn't feel that was right for this project, and what our organ students do, the uses we'd make of the organ. The primary focus, of course, is congregational singing. Some of the design actually goes back over 10 years to the original plans for the chapel back in the late 90s. And as I said, a subcommittee there that really came up with a concept about what the organ should be, and even a specification of exactly what would be in it. So then when the project was revived again a few years ago, then we revisited that and pretty much stayed with what it was at that time. Chance is a company that's been around for a long time. I think it's 137 years. So it's a very stable company. I think that was one. When we looked at different companies, going back again over 10 years, that original subcommittee looked at about 15 different organ companies. We did limit it to American and Canadian companies. As I recall, we didn't look at any European companies other than to briefly talk about that. And you always get into the currency exchanges and how that affects the price and all of that. I would say there was one English company that we more seriously considered. Then I think Chance's track record with larger instruments, their record with instruments in addition to church instruments, and certainly financially, I would characterize it as they were not the most expensive, they were not the cheapest. They were in the middle, and you had to balance, in the organ world, I think, quality versus price. You need a certain level of quality. Some builders might have been cheaper, but we didn't feel they were of the quality that Chance is. The Chance company was very happy about this project too. That one of the things I asked the voicers of the pipes when they were here earlier this year was, what made this project special for them or in the organ world? And their response was, because you did everything else right. Which often organs are put into places where you have to work around an existing building, or the organ company is brought in after the building is built or way down the line while the building is being planned, and then there are compromises. In this case, we really didn't have to compromise in terms of the position of the organ, where it's placed. It's on a long axis of the room. That's the best thing for a pipe organ. It is up high. It's in a case. All of those things are huge factors in making it a successful instrument. So Chance was able to do that, and they were so happy about it that they featured this organ on the cover of an organist magazine in October. That's a huge thing in the organ world. I've described it to people as in the sports world, when you make the cover of Sports Illustrated, that's big time. in the organ world, when you make the cover of the American Organist magazine, you don't get any higher than that. So, yeah, we didn't aim for that, but it happened. And I think it's a testimony to the project and the importance of the project on a much wider scale than we were thinking at the time of the project.
In the WELS, we've always kind of downplayed, I shouldn't say downplayed, we always haven't spent the money in a lot of situations to really have good art. And we tend to be rather pragmatic, and the means of grace, the gospel, that's where it's at. But I do think when God gives the gift to the church of people who have artistic skills, Pastor Pope in stone and woodwork, his daughter in artwork, the theological knowledge he had to also then put it so Christocentric. I think it's wrong for the church not to utilize those, because then you have a worship space in which, even in private meditation before or after, you do see and are reminded of the work of Christ on our behalf.
One of the design features of the building was to have a baptismal font at the entryway. And we actually asked the architects that we would like to have them think about designing the building so that everybody that entered had to pass by the baptismal font. There was not an option. Like, there would not be a doorway on the side where you could enter the space, but you had to pass the symbol of your baptism on the way to worship. And that was a request that we had of the architect early on, and of course they carried that through. And the second thing we'd ask was that baptism receive enough space in the building, the symbol receive enough space in the building to balance out the other symbols, so that compared to the altar or compared to the ambo, the symbol would be large enough so there'd be some balance in space for the symbol of the sacrament. So they also carried that out. And the size was actually our decision. We came in with a tape measure and measured off 6 feet and 8 feet and 10 feet. And
It was my job to figure out how many gallons of water we needed. Okay? So, of course, I did the prudent thing, realizing that I wasn't very good in math in college and high school. I took it to Joyce Deals in the math department, and I said, Joyce, figure out how many gallons of water we need. Okay, so what was it? It was 278 gallons of water, I think. Yeah. And, you know, that was a concern, too, because basically a gallon of water weighs 8 pounds. You know, so we were adding a considerable amount of weight to the floor, and we wondered about if we had that supported well enough underneath, in addition to framing the whole thing with stone. Okay, and then tiling it, too. The original design, too, on the inside of the font was a key role, because that symbol is very prominent in the chapel. It's the chapel of the Christ. So the key row is the predominant symbol in the church. But it didn't look right with the tile, with square tiles. It looked kind of amateurish. So we asked the architect to come up with a different design, and he came up with kind of a double Greek cross, equal lengths, with triangles on the end.
I hadn't really seen the prominence of a baptistry in some of the other designs, and especially in a chapel. But the Martin Luther College said, you know what? We're probably not going to baptize babies in here, but it could happen, and it's very important in our faith as well. So let's celebrate that entry point of the worship space, and we did that.
But you don't want to look past the baptismal font, which is right by the door, purposely placed there because we want you to remember that you became a member of the family of Christ through baptism. That's your entrance. And we want us all to remember that entrance point.
the other thing we'd ask was we wanted the early church symbol of living water, moving water. So we wanted water in the font, and we wanted to have it moving. There were a few complaints about the amount of noise when the building's quiet or when you have somebody speaking from the ambo. So we shut it off for a while during worship. And then people began to ask why it wasn't on. So then we turned it back on. And it's been on ever since for worship. We've not turned it off, have had no more complaints. It's been interesting.
I like the running water during our services. We experimented for a while with turning it off because it took a little getting used to having this water going all the time. And we're still tweaking that whole thing too. But I like that constant reminder.
It's now become kind of the ambiance of the building. It's something you hear all the time, but it doesn't really seem to interfere with your attention to what goes on at the chancel. So it's been an interesting process in that respect, and I guess I'm personally happy that we have it on because it was a major symbol for the building to have living water, moving water as part of the font. One of the design requests of the architects was that when we enter the space, the focus should be on Christ, and we did have the symbol of the cross, and we had said at the initial stage, the cross and a crucifix. That was our thinking. So when people enter and they start looking up, that they also start looking at the chief symbol of Christ and Christ's death on the cross for sin.
Architectonically, I get them to focus with how the structure works. These crossing columns overhead, sort of creating this arch effect, really puts your head forward. Lighting and the altar backdrop, this very large, beautiful wood development that is the backdrop to the altar. The corpus hangs right in front of it, and you have the triptych that's built into that back wall. And then above that is the beautiful glass. So to get them to focus, I have those architectonic elements. Also, because the distance is shorter, it's bigger. So force perspective in a way, you're much closer to the altar than you are to that organ that's on your left. So again, the shape of the space helped us in that regard. From baptistry to altar is a much shorter distance than from even the center of the worship space to the pipe organ.
Now, we also have what we called on the building committee the sacramental access. In other words, that if you stand right at the middle of the entrance, the font, the altar, the cross, they all line up. And that was done very intentionally. So the pulpit is offset, that's true. Although we did talk for a little while about putting the pulpit, configuring that in the middle somehow too. But we decided to keep the font and the altar and the cross on this main short access.
And as you walk in, and just the orientation of font, ambo, altar, and then ultimately to the triptych tied in with the stone, you have a very visual, if you will, axis for the chapel and its means of grace. And then you think in terms of how that visually is integrated and how architecturally it demonstrates the same thing. The focus always comes back to means of grace.
We never at the time thought about a cross like this. This was not our idea. This came from Nathan Pope, who, as we talked about, well, we would like a cross and a crucifix in there, what would you suggest? And we had always been thinking three-dimensional, both for the cross and for the crucifix. And he asked us if we were interested in a painted cross. And that was something we had just not thought about. And then also a painted two-dimensional figure of Christ. And we were having troubles, to be real honest with you, getting a visual concept of what he was talking about. He showed us some pictures and so forth, but we couldn't imagine it in this space. And what we were really concerned about was seating that goes around the cross, kind of, how is that going to work in a space like this? So we actually went to St. Peter's in Fond du Lac to look at a similar one that he had done for that church to get a good idea of it. And then once Nathan Pope got a sense of the space, the size of the space, then he actually increased the size of the cross, the length of the cross, to accommodate the volume of space we have. And And we seem to be, we think it was pretty successful just proportion-wise in the building. Seems to fill up enough space in front that we had allowed for it, and does seem to draw attention to this portion of the building.
There is a phenomenon in art called horror vacui, Latin, which means horror of emptiness. People are instinctively threatened by emptiness, but artists know that emptiness is one of the greatest tools to create attention. In other words, this is positive space, this piece of wood. How do I present this in the most dramatic way to create an attention getter or a focal point? If I take this and bracket it against my body as if it were a wall, you still see it, okay? But it's not all that dramatic. If this were, for example, a cross and I put it against the wall, well, you still see a cross, but it's not as dramatic as if I take this and then suspend it out into the middle of nothingness. And the more negative nothingness I put around this positive space, the more it jumps out.
And then the figure you see, the Christus Rex, was really a secondary thought, because we initially asked Melanie Schutte to do the crucifix. And so we were satisfied with that. And then I think it was President Zarling who suggested, have you thought about doing Christus Rex as well, to have two figures? So we thought about that a while, and then decided to ask Melanie to design also the risen Christ. So our plans right now are, we actually just made this decision just a little while ago. We're going to display the corpus from Advent until Easter, and then Christus Rex from Easter till the next Advent. Academically, in the academic calendar, most of the time that'll be about half the year for each. So we thought that might be and then with Advent, of course, the humiliation, we thought we would put the corpus up there as a symbol of that plan of God unfolding. Well, the symbol of the Sacrament of Holy Communion, of course, was the other request that we had of architects. We wanted it very visible, large for the large space, and we wanted it elevated high enough so that the entire congregation could see it from a flat floor. So one of the early decisions was how high do you make this platform and make that possible? So one of the things the committee did was we went into the gymnasium and took out a tape measure, and we knew that the architect was planning on a max of 75 feet from where I'm standing to the last row of chairs. So we measured that off. We put John Bulgy up on a chair, and the rest of us sat down back on some folding chairs so we could kind of see over one another's heads. And then we kept raising him to figure out if we needed 3 or 4 or 5 steps up so that everything could be visible in here. Ended up, we thought it has to be at least 5 for everybody to be able to see altar and also speaker up here at the same time. So that was part of the process, kind of one of those very practical things you don't think about at the beginning. How do you make this decision?
When we were determining just how the steps should be laid out toward the altar for communion distribution, I used some of the many scraps of wood in my attic and built the communion distribution simulation stations, which were a lot of different size wooden boxes that we would set up in different formats, 2 steps, 3 steps, until we got the feel for what would work well for distributing Lord's Supper.
The altar, again, is a Nathan Pope design. We had simply said we wanted a large altar, a large symbol in the space, and all of the symbolism in here came from him.
Again, challenges on the design side were really, from my vantage point, making that altar platform be larger than it really is, or the altar on top of that platform feel larger and more important than its size would indicate. And that happens on many worship space projects, to get everybody's eyes in this great big space to focus on that
The major theme of the chancel design is the altar itself. As I tell people, the altar is the focal point. It's the center of attention. And that then creates a strategy of how to present that. You don't want to crowd the altar.
He suggested the idea of combining stone and wood for the altar. And we had never thought of that at all. We had always been thinking just wood. But when he suggested that there might be a possibility of combining stone and wood, it opened up a way to highlight the chief symbols using the material of stone. So that you have stone at the base of the altar, the font is stone, the same stone, there's stone behind the triptych, there's stone under the anvil. It was a way to bring all of that into some kind of unity. And so we really liked that idea. And of course then he layers that with other symbolism like 12 stones on the base of the altar for the 12 tribes of Israel, and builds into the altar all kinds of law and gospel symbolism.
Every prayer I've ever said in any setting has been a valid prayer through Christ, a God-pleasing good work through Christ. But when I prayed at the chapel on that sacrificial lamb that's on the altar that only the presider has the privilege of seeing during the service, but there in 4 languages, it is finished, the reason you can be confident the prayer is being heard, that was just, it was just exciting.
One of the chaplains said that the first time he conducted chapel and used the altar here, having the lamb in the middle of the altar just really caught him off guard emotionally. That here he is proclaiming Christ, and the lamb is symbolically here in front of him. It was one of those, again, one of the things we hadn't thought about or planned on at all, but it's happening. So, very successful design on the part of Nathan Pope.
At the top of the altar, of course, isn't visible to the worshipers. You have to make a point of going up and seeing it, but if you do, it's very rich in symbolism. On each of the 4 corners of the altar, there are bloodwood crosses. And then the 5th cross is actually formed by the trussed legs of the lamb right in the middle. So the 5 crosses on the top of the altar represent the 5 wounds of Christ that he received. That's a historic symbol. Now, certainly he had many, many more wounds than just those 5. I mean, his back was torn apart, his head. Then there is in the 4 languages that we emphasize here, the confessional languages, English and Latin and Greek and German, it is finished, and behold the Lamb of God. That points to our heritage here of keeping people rooted in those Lutheran languages, the languages of Lutheran theology. There's 10 small blocks of wood embedded into the top of the altar, and that is symbolic of the 10 Commandments, the law. And 7 of them have the pattern running north and south, and 3 of them have the pattern running east and west. So you have the 2 tables of the law, the 3 that represent our relationship with God, and then the other 7, our relationship with our neighbor. And of course, dominating the altar in the middle is the sacrificial lamb. Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. Banding the altar are triangles. Okay? All symbolic, intended to be symbolic of the Trinity. And that those small wooden triangles that are embedded around the edge, the banding, are also picked up on the pulpit and then on the base of the triptych as well.
The idea of a triptych in the chapel was something on the minds of several of the committee members after we saw Nathan Pope's work and Melanie Schute's work in Faith Antioch, in our church in Faith Antioch. We saw the paintings that Melanie had done, and we were just struck by the beauty of those paintings. So a couple of us proposed to the committee members that we think about a triptych And that's about as far as we went at the initial stage. We didn't have subject matter in mind at all, or content. What would it be? What would it be like? What would its shape be like? We didn't have any of that, but we did want to have some artwork in the building. And of course, to complement the cross, we wanted the artwork to highlight Christ in some way. Also to carry out the name of the chapel, Chapel of the Christ, certainly would have to be somehow associated with Christ. So again, the subject matter was not our idea, but was the idea of Nathan Pope, who came up with the idea, the connection between subject matter for artwork, focus on Christ, and the institution, the college. And so his thinking was combine the idea of teaching with Christ and the triptych. So he proposed to us that we feature Christ as teacher in the panels, with Christ with the teachers of the law in the middle, being the symbol of the faculty, not the way we might normally think of the faculty, but the other way around, sitting at the feet of a teacher, and then to focus on the male population of the student body and the female population of the student bodies.
And all the pictures in the triptych emphasize teaching. You have Christ on the left with the Emmaus disciples. The one sermon I wish that the Spirit would have recorded, how he's starting with Moses and the prophets, he explained everything about himself. And then on the right you have Mary and Martha, of course, sitting at Jesus' feet. She has chosen what is needful and better. And then in the middle, the boy Jesus sitting among the teachers in the temple. So for 125 years, this campus has emphasized teaching. And pastors do a lot of teaching too. So it's not just a teacher motif, it's really what the ministry is about. And finally Jesus said, go and make disciples by teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you.
And when Melanie started fleshing this out and started painting, we were even more struck with her work this time than we were in Faith Antioch. Our perception was that her skills as a painter were just still developing, and we're the beneficiaries of that. And everyone that comes in really just is very complimentary about the work that she has done. And of course, it keeps us focused on our task as a college, the teaching aspect of it, and also keeps the faculty and their focus as sitting at the feet of Christ and listening, especially here in this building, as we go about our work here.
Now, we really haven't had a Lenten season in the chapel yet, but what we're planning to do is close the triptych, where the crown of thorns is on the back, and then there are no paraments during the Lenten season.
The move from the old chapel to the new was an experience that I don't think any of us will ever forget. It was a very emotional but serious and joyful, with a little bit of sadness in leaving something that we had been a part of for many decades in our previous chapel auditorium, but that kind of inner joy that just really swelled up that day.
I was involved with a choir on that day, so I was in the building at the beginning of the line, or early on in the line. And it's the first time on the campus I can remember the entire group, students, faculty alike, coming into a building and being dead silent, absolutely dead silence, until all 800 had found their places. It was these 3-4 minutes of absolute silence, which never happened in the auditorium. It happened walking in here.
And I think the procession from the old chapel auditorium to the new in really silence, and I was fairly one of the earlier people in that procession because I had to get over to the organ bench. But then to be over there as 900 people come walking in silence and just stand in awe of everything that the chapel is. That was really cool.
And I still remember that day and sitting back and thinking of one hymn, God himself is present, all within keep silent. I kept thinking, the symbolism must be strong enough to make this happen, that there is this clear focus on Christ.
It is amazing and it is thrilling it wasn't the official dedication, but the first use, affectionately known as the soft opening, when we began the chapel service in the auditorium and everyone walked over quietly into the new space. And it was just thrilling. When we sang Crown Him with Many Crowns with the choirs having some of the verses. And in that space, when the choir sang, Behold his hands inside, I was nearly in the front row, so I had to look up pretty high, but I looked up, and there was that image of Christ on the cross with his hands inside, pierced. And that was just thrilling.
Number one, study the past. Nothing is done in a vacuum. None of us can say that we're Melchizedek, that we have no beginning and no end. And yet it's odd how often this happens when it comes to guys who put together worship bulletins or create special services. It's like the past never happened. And my point is that Solomon said it for the whole ages, that there's nothing new under the sun. If you want to plan something new, then look at the old, because you're not going to really find anything revolutionary new. It's the same set. If you have an altar, you have a font, you have a pulpit, how you arrange them, style, symbolism, that can all change. You can tweak those things, but the important thing is to study the past. If you don't know the past, you don't know where you're going.
The building design is a blend of contemporary and traditional elements, and that's a statement in our time that I hope others will see and think that we recognize the past and the important contributions of that, but we live also in the present and we look forward to the future. And those are things that are all wrapped up, and I would hope that others in the Synod would see this as a model of how that can be portrayed in bricks and stone and wood and art and everything else that's in the building, and an encouragement maybe that no matter what the economic times might be, Christians can do something if their motivation is to give glory to God, to spread his word through what they do, to encourage fellow Christians, all of those things. This is a model for that. I truly believe that.
Perhaps we've had something of a tendency in church building to err on the side of practicality. Just it's big enough for us, and it's sturdy enough so it won't blow down, and therefore it is a fine worship place. And it is, but maybe this is helping us aim higher for excellence, for beauty, for communicating more things about our Savior visually.
But finally, the whole world the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, right? Psalm 24. And he has endowed it with beauty, and he has put that into us. And artistic expression is very, very much appropriate. Not just efficiency and not just cost, but what can we do that's also beautiful, that inspires? Solomon and David did not have to build the temple they built. It did not have to look like that. But it was, and when Zerubbabel rebuilt it, it didn't look like that. But there was beauty there in it. Yeah. The rabbis used to say, if you hadn't seen the temple in Jerusalem, you've never seen a beautiful building. They said that of Herod's temple, which in of itself was a wonderful accomplishment, but imagine Solomon's temple. Must have been unbelievably cool.
I learned a lot as I watched men struggle. How would we communicate what we hold so dear through brick, stone, paint? And God blessed it. And I think there are ways for us, if we can get past just the utilitarian and the practical, and we think only, I'm not saying we don't think about it, how's this is going to be enough heat in here, what's it going to, all that stuff. But to also think through and to take the time, what do we want it to look like? Within our budget. But how would we best communicate what the Spirit has put in our hearts about the reality of salvation, full and free in Christ? How can we best communicate so that someone walking in off the street or a visitor coming, they see at an instance what this place is all about? And not just what's a generic church, or what is this place all about?
It never crossed our mind that somebody would walk in, whether from the community or from our synod, and ask about symbols in the building. And so you have this opportunity to talk about like the 10 Commandments, the symbol in the altar that he's got in there, talk about the law and the lamb at the middle, to talk about Christ, the sacrifice. I mean, they're just wonderful opportunities to witness to who Christ is that we never even thought about.
I haven't had so much fun doing outreach for a long time. We have so many visitors coming. And if I'm around, you take them in, can I explain the artwork? Come up to the altar. Can I tell you what this means? And you can do a very specific law gospel in the harshest of law and the sweetest of the gospel. And people don't get mad at you. And to me, that impact I did not anticipate.
We had a number of high school students coming to campus, and watching them come into chapel on Friday morning was so interesting, because you see them doing exactly what you hope. They look up, they look toward the altar, and they sort of stand still in a minute, just overcome by the whole space. And how that will play out in their lives, and I think for some of them, they'll remember that experience for a good long time, and that'll have some effect, who knows where, how God might use that.
Not only do we have the privilege of our own students getting to see it, and moms and dads, grandmas and grandpas, and high school kids, but we get people coming from, people take bus trips to New Ulm and they'll go to the chapel. People from down south in Iowa, people from the cities. We had a church from Mount Olive, from Lutheran Church in Minneapolis, who called us up and wanted to have a tour of the chapel. And it's so great that our chapel is able to communicate the gospel. I just keep being so thankful that not just to our students, but to these people who may not know the gospel that clearly because of their background or their church. You get to see Christ crucified in this chapel very clearly. I think that's a great statement, the great purpose for this facility.
We have community members that come on campus, and they may come to eat at the cafeteria, and they come out and decide they're going to just peek into the chapel. It happened to me just last week. There was a group of 5 ladies that had come up from downtown. They came to eat at the cafeteria, and on their way out, they decided, well, let's just take a peek into the chapel. I happened to be setting some things up for a choir rehearsal, and they had all kinds of questions, including this one. When do you have chapel services, and are they open to the public? Might we actually come and attend one of these? I said, absolutely, and gave her the times. That kind of communication, it's just a blessing we hadn't thought about. And then the visitors that asked about various elements in the building, that gives us opportunity to talk about Christ. So whether they're thinking that way when they enter the doors, many times when they are in here, they start asking questions that gives us opportunity to talk about it. So,
Just the presence of the building, the size of the building, even for visitors, they end up, wow, This is significant. And that just sends a message. This is what's most important. We had, last March, we had the Upper Midwest Athletic Conference meeting. So the presidents or chancellors, the athletic directors, the faculty, sports advisor, whatever. So there are about 50 people from the conference schools. And it's on a rotating basis, and it just happened to be MLC's time. And it was end of March. We had just started our soft opening. I think we had just been in there a little bit. And these guys wanted to see the chapel. And I said, okay. And it was after supper, and I went over ahead of time, turn up, make sure lights are on and stuff. And I just watched these people come in. Another one of those unforgettable moments. You get these people, and yeah, some are from Christian colleges, but there are a couple public colleges, but they walk in and they just absolutely stood still, even before they got past the baptismal font. And they were absolutely quiet. They were just looking. And their eyes went to the font, their eyes went to the altar, their eyes went to the suspended crucifix, and then to the triptych. And to me, that was visible testimony that God blessed the efforts of Pastor Pope, of Melanie, his daughter, because it just arrested people. And they were confronted with the Christ. In art, and I didn't say anything. And then later on, can we go up, can he explain more about the altar and, the things, everything that Pastor Pope has put into that. And it's a wonderful opportunity. But just that initial look.
Seeing God's people respond to the project, not just with enthusiastic comments, but also with their offerings. A lot of times these special things, like these banners here, all of a sudden there was money for it. And that's the way it is with God's people. They are given an opportunity to do something, and very secretly, very quietly, often very anonymously, they just do it.
I make a point, if I can, now and then, as I sit there, especially before chapel, to just think about all the gifts and offerings that went into that place. I have no idea the numbers, but I'm sure some gifts were major, and some gifts were the widow's mite. And the numbers that tallied up on the sheet probably ran several digits left of the decimal in some cases, and maybe only a relative few were of substantial size. The gifts that fellow Christians brought to this campus for that building reflect a love for the gospel, but also for their brothers and sisters in Christ, especially these young brothers and sisters in Christ who are preparing for ministry. And sometimes I'll just deliberately sit and think about that and be encouraged. It's a nice reminder of the work that's done here as an extension of Christians walking together, and in this aspect of the walk together, training the next generation, telling these people what their fathers and mothers told them.
The building, I think, has really touched lives of some students. And it's not so much the shape, although I think subconsciously the Spirit's working through that artwork and working through, we're campus family more than just all students and faculty here. We're part of the body of Christ. We enter as baptized children. We enter because of that into the presence of God. But that baptism not only unites us with Christ, it does unite us with each other. That I think is a very, I'm not saying they all understand that right away, but I think that's a very powerful message. The other thing that I was going to say is, on some level, for a lot of the students, as they watched it go up, as they saw the size of the hole that was dug, as they saw the size of the building, I think, again, maybe subconsciously, but some of them went, wow. And then they began to realize there are a lot of God's people, a lot of Christians all over gave a lot of money for this. Wow. And it's really because they want to see more pastors and teachers. I mean, people are praying for us. I mean, this is high on the radar. It takes the level up. I'm going to college, and maybe I still got 4 years of college and 4 years of seminary. It takes it to a different level. God's people gave millions to make this happen for this place that I can come and train. And you think about that, and then the next step, of course, is, and they maybe don't always understand it, but the same Holy Spirit that creates the gift of generosity has also created the gift of really first glorify God and pray for the work of the gospel. That what comes first, the commitment of God's people to the gospel and to training pastors and teachers and staff ministers.